I am really delighted to have this lady on as a guest. Amity Shlaes is a terrific writer. I read her book about the Depression, The Forgotten Man. It completely reconfigured my understanding of the Depression. I think a lot of people's understanding of the Depression. But she has another book that I'm really fascinated by. I've only just started it, called The Great Society, A New History. Amity Shlaes chairs the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, which already speaks very highly of her. And I just want to talk to her about the Great Society because I think it is actually one of the most important topics not being discussed today. Amity, are you there?
Glad to be here.
There, I've got you. Okay, thank you. Let's begin with this. I mean, a lot of my audience is not going to even know really what the Great Society is. So can you just describe what that means, what those words mean?
Idealistic time, early 60s. You don't want just a good society, you want a great society. So it was a sort of national experiment. Beware of the word great, right? Always. National experiment to elevate us from pretty darn good to greatness. And the overarching question, Andrew, was how do you do that? Through the public sector or the private sector? We opted for the public sector. And the phrase itself comes from President Lyndon Johnson, who launched it on a college campus at Michigan in Ann Arbor in a speech. We're going to have a great society. We're going to be better in the classroom, better in the cities, better in the countryside. 3 C's, great society. We're going to do it. And we're going to eradicate poverty. Cure poverty was the verb President Johnson used. He didn't say reduce poverty. There was nothing modest about the Great Society. It was all the way we can do this.
So this is one of the things that fascinates me about it. Here it is, it's the 1960s. The people are rebelling. Johnson couldn't even win a second term. I mean, he was thrown into the presidency by the assassination of Kennedy. He couldn't even win a second term. He was not that popular. What made people feel that the public sector was the way to go? I mean, we were all supposed to be so anti-establishment then. What made people feel that we were going to become great through the public sector instead of the private sector?
Just the impulse towards the collective and towards control is the short answer. In the book, I have a character who really lived and was very interesting named Michael Harrington. And he was just like a young progressive today, very bright, very funny, very likable, and wrote a book that was a version of Hillbilly Elegy, right? He wrote a book about the other America, the impoverished America in Appalachia. Nothing is new, it's just repeated, right? So he writes this book and someone in the Kennedy circle reads it. He comes into the White House and says, we have to do something for all the poor, not just a few poor, and nothing incremental. It's a temperament thing too. Let's have a revolution. Let's mount a revolution. And this idea kind of excited some people. And President Kennedy was assassinated, but the Harrington impulse to do something grand stayed. And Johnson then turned that into a bunch of laws to eradicate poverty. Why did Michael Harrington think you couldn't do that locally? He was a socialist. He said that. Socialists think collective and big. So I think the error, in my view, is this assumption that doing work for the collective is better than doing work for individuals, or that change can't come from below. But there it was. And Harrington was disillusioned. I trace him through the story in a nervous breakdown. He was a very interesting, lovable guy, but he was totally wrong on this. And we got laws that we still live with long after he kind of veered out of there.
So can you detail a couple of those laws? I mean, just to give an idea of what these programs were.
Well, one of the most important, which I never mentioned in the book, shame on me, Great Society, was the laws that created public radio, because they created a modern consensus which tends in a certain direction now. We love public radio. We're on it. But because I think in good measure, because public radio comes from government, supported by government, even if viewers and listeners send in money, it tends to favor government. Another thing that happened, a law that was very important, began a culture of law, we should say, that began with Kennedy and an executive order he didn't really even pay attention to when he was signing 10988. That was public sector unionism. So that made teacher unions, we used to have teacher associations, but unions in a powerful way. And again, school teachers, we love them. We love our schools. They tend progressive too, because they're a union and they work for the government. And they're hard to change because of the power of those teachers' unions. So those are two unmentioned laws or undermentioned. Others would be the expansion of what we might call welfare. And a very much key one was there were big laws, but a key sub-law, let's call it that, was the creation of federal funding for public interest lawyers. Mm-hmm. It used to be you had a pro bono lawyer, and he was somebody who did it out of the good of his heart, or maybe possibly he worked for the ACLU. But there weren't federally funded public interest lawyers. And in the war on poverty, which is what the Great Society also came to be called, we began to fund thousands of public interest lawyers working in states. John F. Kennedy's brother, Bob, called for it in a famous University of Chicago speech. We need to have public sector and public interest lawyers everywhere. And those lawyers tended to make cases, guess what, that said, let's make government bigger. They weren't small government public interest lawyers. So these are the cultural parts. But the overarching act for some of this was the Economic Opportunity Act. That doesn't sound so terrible. Conservatives are for opportunity, right? Well, progressives are for entitlement. It was carefully worded, but it fostered entitlement, that law. And I think another factor here that matters to this day, when you think about entitlements and entitlement spending, that is things you get from the government to which you're entitled, was a Supreme Court case called Goldberg v. Kelly, which said welfare is property. Basically, before that, welfare was something you got if the social worker liked you. That was pretty offensive, right? The social worker could take the money away if she didn't like your family structure, your shoes, what all. But after that, it was an entitlement as property, and that cemented the entitlement culture that we have. And that's very important too. So those are a few of the things in the book. I go through a number of them. Relating to housing, for example, giant housing law.
So the book is Great Society, A New History by Amity Shlaes. They were going to cure poverty. Has poverty been cured?
Poverty's not been cured. The poor are always with us, right? Poverty. One of the perverse things about in recent administrations that government economists have done and say, look, we cured poverty, by which they meant, let's count all the benefits that poor people get. Look, it's cured. We spend enough. Poor people do often get food stamps or housing subsidy or college subsidy. That's wonderful. Nobody wants anyone to starve. We want to help people, but the poverty is there. What do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. When I was speaking in a high school in Arizona, I was talking about how Richard Nixon was actually the devil when it came to expansion of food stamps. Johnson had food stamps. Nixon had mega food stamps. Why? Because Richard Nixon liked the agriculture lobby. He wanted people to be calm. He wanted to worry about the Vietnam War, not about peace at home. Food stamps expanded. And I explained about that, and a young lady got up and said, how dare you shame people on food stamps? And I said, no one is shaming people on food stamps. But you even can agree that it would be a shame if not only your parent, but also your child needed food stamps. That would be something to regret. And what we created was a sort of habit of receiving money and entitlement that helped no one. And I think if you interview anywhere, you'll find no one who thinks it's great for every generation to need food stamps. Opportunity it is a better solution for most people.
And what about the idea that so you get people who are become dependent on government aid and they're not inspired to move upward. What about the idea that this has been destructive to families? I mean, I know when I was a kid, there was about a 25% rate of fatherlessness among poor black families. It is now, I think, over 75%, which is worse than it was when in slavery days. I mean, when people were actually selling families into different places. Did the Great Society have anything to do with that?
Absolutely. But you want to assign some of that blame to the 50s, because we had welfare and welfare rules in the 50s. And if you go back and read the interviews in that period, it's heartbreaking. In public housing from the early urban renewal, structures, new then splendid seeming projects, the social worker would come and say, is there a dad here? If there's a dad here, you're evicted. And the mom would lie and say, there is no dad. The dad might be under the bed. Children were forced to lie. And that antedates Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and goes back to state welfare laws, which had an interesting premise. If dad is there, he should work and they should pay for their own apartment. It's just an example of how perverse, well-meaning rules, what perverse outcomes they could have. This was strengthened with some edits in the 60s. To qualify for this or that, you had to have a low income, and often that meant no dad. And what welfare also did, frankly, was make people feel they didn't need a dad or another parent because they were getting a check. The primary source became the check. And why do you need a family if you want to be independent? But then you realize later as a parent, well, maybe you need that other parent, and it's too late. So there it is. Long ago, I observed writing a journalism article in college. I went to look at a home for unwed mothers, and they were unfortunately trained to the check. You're going to get a check. Your mother's going to take care of you. The dad was not in the picture of these young mothers' situation. They were having babies somewhere in high school or over high school age, but not in school. And the goal was to keep them in high school, but to get them a check. And we never, the people in the situation never talked about the dad, because that would hurt the feelings of the girl, because the dad was not helping out. But the whole culture, well-meaning as it was, perpetuated the idea that welfare gives you independence. Look, you can finally leave your mom because you get a check. Every high school girl, whatever age, wants to leave her mom, right? So we did that. And we even we did that, and we set this all up. We set this all up. We taught people that entitlements are more important than opportunity.
So I have a theory I want to run by you, and you're allowed to tell me it's completely ridiculous, but it seems to me we've elected a black president twice. It seems to me this is a country that has gotten past its racial history, which was indeed shameful. And yet we are continually being ginned up to hate each other and to look at each other according to the color of our skin. And I begun to believe that what the politicians are trying to protect and obscure is the failure of the Great Society. Because after all, this is, in order to spend this money has to be flood into government. It gives government tremendous power. It gives them tremendous power of patronage. It gives them tremendous power to buy votes through government largesse. And it's failed. It has failed to do what it was supposed to do. And in fact, it has had negative consequences. Is that plausible? Is it plausible that a lot of what we're seeing today?
It's entirely plausible. The Great Society, I won't say elephant. Is it the elephant in the room or the donkey in the room? But anyway, the force in the room we are not going to acknowledge. And you can see that actually with the enormous emotional references to Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt had the New Deal. It was a big social program. Let's be like him. President Biden put a big picture of Franklin Roosevelt up. I think he has a bust of Eleanor, too, of the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. He didn't put Lyndon Johnson front and center. He put the New Deal, the preceding big social program, not the Great Society, in his showcase. Because you know what? If you examine the Great Society, you don't like the result, whatever party you're in. So, but that is kind of what President Biden wants to do, and what many Republicans wants to do, resembles more the Great Society than it does the New Deal. And in fact, in dollar for dollar, when you look at federal spending, Andrew, we spend more on Great Society commitments than we do on New Deal commitments. The New Deal commitment was Social Security, basically. The Great Society was welfare and we all kinds of projects, including education and housing projects. And that amount, those lines crossed in the early 2000s. So the Great Society, we live in the Great Society. We're living in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society today. We walk in it. And actually, Joe Califano, who was in that administration, wrote that sentence. So let me attribute it, but I liked it so much. We're living in it. We're created by it, less than by the New Deal. The New Deal set the precedent, but the Great Society was the big follow-on, and it wasn't great.
This is something everyone should know about. The book is The Great Society, A New History by Amity Shlaes, Shlaes. Amity, thank you so much. It's wonderful to meet you. I'm such an admirer. I hope you'll come back and talk again.